Good evening, everyone. I'm Tyler Putman here in Liberty, Don Troiani's Paintings of the Revolutionary War, live from the Museum of the American Revolution, joined by our pal Kalela Williams. We're really excited to welcome you to this evening performance and talkback of Meet James Forten, an exciting original play commissioned from playwright Marissa Kennedy by the museum. And we're really grateful to Comcast NBC Universal for sponsoring our evening program and our larger African American Interpretive initiative, which you're going to hear more about from Mike Idriss. But before we get further into it, I'm really excited to introduce our pal Sean Casey, a senior director with Comcast's Military and Veterans Affairs Department.
Good evening, everybody. It's our privilege to sponsor tonight's showing of Meet James Forten as part of the museum's Diversify Living History initiative. At Comcast NBC Universal, we recognize the legacy and impact that people of African descent have and continue to play in shaping the culture and history of the United States. Individuals like James Forten, a patriot, businessman, an advocate for the voiceless, influenced our nation's continuous pursuit to create a more perfect union. We're excited to see this incredible man's story come to life this evening. Thank you to the Museum of the American Revolution for bringing us all together here tonight. Enjoy the performance.
Thanks, Sean. Couple bits of easy housekeeping for everyone. We'd love to hear in the chat if you visited the museum before or where you're tuning in from. It's really exciting. We have a ton of folks tuning in tonight. So let us know, where are you watching from? What do you like about the museum? Kalela Williams, who I'm joined by, is the founder of Black History Maven, a longtime collaborator with the museum in our Living History projects, our Diversify Living History initiative. And after the performance, I'm going to vacate my seat, give it up to Mike Idriss, who is the museum's African American Interpretive Fellow, lifelong Philadelphian, who was really the brains behind this incredible play that you're going to see, the historical advisor on this piece, written by Marissa Kennedy, which you'll see performed by Nathan Alford-Tate. We're really excited to be doing a lot with James Forten's story, not just right now when you can visit this cool painting that you'll hear more about later, but also in the future. We've got exciting programming and exhibitions about the Forten family coming up. But I don't want to steal any of that thunder. I'm going to let you ask questions of Kalela and Mike and Nathan later. So feel free to drop your questions into the chat either during the performance or afterwards, when Kalela will be moderating a conversation and selecting some of those questions for these guys to answer. So without further ado, take your seats and meet James Forten.
William, my dear brother-in-law. So this is the Commerce, ready to take us to England. It's almost time to set sail. A new voyage, a new opportunity. I know this kind of journey is familiar to you, but this is a new adventure for me. This is my home, Dock Ward. The noise of the wharfs, the mingling of different accents and languages. Irish, German, West Indian, West African, British. I've spent years watching the arrival and departures of ships filled with traded goods like this one. Men loading cargo, rope makers at work. I was in awe of the ship's carpenters, shaping the wood and repairing damage from each ship's most recent voyage. I especially loved watching the sailors hoist the sails that my father made. You know how much we all talk about my father? Thomas. My father taught me to read. We would practice reading scripture, or father would teach me the words of the hymns that we sang on Sundays. As a boy, I followed him to Robert Bridges' sail loft, where he worked alongside white and black men, the only free African there. My father was meticulous in his work. He gave close and careful attention to every sail he crafted. I would sit close to him, watching as he laid out the canvas across the floor and cut out the shapes of the sails. The sails were so big, they had to be hoisted through the window. I had to stay clear of the way so not to get knocked down by their size and weight. When I got older, my father began teaching me sail making. I'd help out around the loft by sweeping the floor or picking over scrap canvas to preserve the usable pieces. I'd prepare beeswax for sewing thread. Its sweet, honeyish smell at my fingertips. My father gave me this sail-making fid. It was his. I learned how to use it. Stretching the canvas for grommets, I even learned how to sew a few canvas pieces myself. And by the end of the day, my hands were stiff and feet ached from all the work. My devout Anglican father reminded me that God would indeed bless us if we followed the work of the Lord and not of men. Eventually, he ventured on his own, making a few sails here and there. I was proud to be following in his footsteps. I imagined that would be my work someday, until he died when I was 7 years old. After my father's death, my mother, Margaret, felt that receiving an education was the next important step. She sought the help of Anthony Benazet. I still admire her for that. Asking a white Quaker teacher to take me as a student? It probably helped that Benazet was always ready to point out the contradiction between slavery and the Christian doctrine. He knew that we could achieve the same things as white people. I think most of society sees us as inherently flawed, lazy, a burden, at least when we're not making a profit for them. But some people, like Robert Bridges and Anthony Benazet, see us for who we are, a people with a rich culture and history. But then again, Robert Bridges is a slaveholder himself. That's the corruption, slavery. My mother and sister, your dear Abigail, provided for the household and my education, but were barely making ends meet. I was only at school for 2 years before I had to stop to find work. I had heard of other free African children being forced into indentured servitude if they or their parents were found to be a burden on society. Boys, younger than me, being forced to work until they were 24 years old. But how? How would that help them or their families? I did whatever I could to support my family. I picked up odd jobs here and there, running up and down Dock Ward, sweeping floors, stocking shelves. I worked at Benazet's grocery store, and sometimes I ran errands for Bridges. I might have stopped school, but I did not stop learning. I read my Bible, the newspaper, and the pamphlets I would come across in the street. News of the rebellion was everywhere, frightening and exciting at the same time. Delegates held meetings. People here in the city boycotted British goods. And then reports from New England about Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill. The revolution had begun. But what did this rebellion mean for Africans? The enslaved Africans at the sail loft did much of the same work as the white journeymen, but their only hope and aspiration was that one day they would be free. Maybe it's a cycle. First, you work your life away trying to earn your freedom, like my grandfather. Then once you get it, you work your life away trying to keep it. I read a pamphlet by Thomas Paine. Thomas, like my father's name. He was the one who showed us the error of our ways. How could Americans say they were slave to British tyranny when there were actual slaves among us, enslaved by the very same people who screamed the loudest about taxation and representation? I was 9, but even I could see there were 2 wars over freedom being fought around me. One was for the liberty and independence of America. One was for the liberty and independence of all Americans. I was at the State House when they read our Declaration of Independence. The bells called me. I weaved in and out of the crowd, trying to get as close as I possibly could. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was how I know we are all equal. We deserve life, liberty, and happiness. Anthony Benezet taught Africans how to read and write because of this truth. Thomas Paine's pamphlet spread the word. The Declaration made it real. But sometimes freedom wears a red coat. The British offered freedom to enslaved Africans who abandoned their rebel masters. So some of us found liberty that way. I can hardly judge the people who joined that cause. What else might the British give free Africans in exchange for their loyalty? Might it be better than what they would get in a newly forged nation? Who held the greater promise? Which side to choose? For me, there was no question. The Declaration rang in my ears. This was my fight for independence, liberty, and the future. At this time, enslaved Africans were granted gradual emancipation. Maybe after this fight, we can get more rights, opportunities, maybe even citizenship. But I had to beg my mother to let me go and fight. I joined a privateer, not the Navy, mind you. This was a better chance. Join a private ship and set sail to fight for the cause. And at no small incentive, a chance at prize money. We were commissioned to capture enemy ships and keep the profits as our own. So I could risk my life for the revolution and also provide for my family. I chose the Royal Lewis, Captain Stephen Decatur, and joined as a powder boy at the young age of 14. My job was to transport the gunpowder from the ship's hold to the cannons on deck amid battle. All I had were the clothes on my back and hope. We were a motley crew. I wasn't the only African aboard the Royal Lewis, but I was one of few people that could read and write his name. But really, none of that mattered. Our lives were in each other's hands. Who we were alone was not as important as who we were together. A crew. And our first cruise on the Royal Lewis was a success. We captured many enemy ships from New York down to Charleston, South Carolina. Many of these ships surrendered without a single shot. And when I returned home, I was in good health, with money in my pocket and the glory of victory in my heart. I turned 15 the day I watched the Continental Army march through the streets of Philadelphia on their way to Yorktown. The Rhode Island Regiment, now with 2 all-African companies, marched proudly by. As brave men as ever fought. They were determined, unstoppable. And I was too. We were doing our part to carve out our place in the new country. I was only home a few days before we were put to sea again. I was ready to capture more British ships. But we were not as untouchable as I thought. We sailed over the horizon and right into British hands. I knew that death in battle could be a possibility, but as a prisoner, for my white shipmates, I knew at best they would be exchanged for British prisoners. At worst, they would be imprisoned for the extent of the war. But for me, I had heard of other captured African sailors being shipped to the West Indies. Slavery? Death in the cane field? I was terrified. I kept the lessons of my parents and the church close to heart. When we boarded the British ship, the Amphion, I promised myself that I had been taken a prisoner for the liberties of my country and would never prove a traitor to her interest. That promise kept me alive. It guided me, sometimes even away from the easy ways out. Because the British captain offered me a new home, to go with his son to England where education and new opportunities awaited. It was a good offer, as anyone in my position could only hope to achieve something more than sweeping floors or stacking crates. But I refused. I had sailed too far to abandon the cause now. And the cost of that decision was the jersey. Even the single word is horrible to me now. A ship with the mast cut off, anchored in New York Harbor. A floating prison filled with men and boys younger than I. I met Daniel Bruton, a white seaman, only 13 years old. But it didn't matter whether we were black or white, free or enslaved. We were literally in this together. Short rations and either hard work cleaning the ship or unending boredom in the airless lower deck. There was sickness and death everywhere. The hull, filled with prisoners held tightly together, the stench was unbearable and unforgettable. Sometimes I wonder if this is what it felt like to be held on a slave ship. Escape seemed impossible. Men who tried to swim ashore risked 2 miles of open water. If they were lucky enough to get over the mud flats undetected, they still had to get to Long Island, which was under the control of the British. We schemed, of course, and once I came very close. An imprisoned officer was to be exchanged, and he would take his sea chest with him. I was just small enough to fit inside, covered by his clothing. But so was Daniel Bruton. And he was 2 years younger and in far worse shape than me. So I switched places to let my white brother in arms depart. I helped him in and wished him well. I thought I could wait it out and be exchanged. Months passed, and slowly my name moved up the ledger. Each month I knew I was getting closer and closer to freedom. I was on the Jersey for 7 months. The war ended before my name ever came up. That was just a year ago. So I walked, shoeless, from Brooklyn to Trenton, where I received aid before arriving in Philadelphia. The war had ended, but I had missed most of the celebrating. My reward was reuniting with a healthy Daniel Bruton. And I certainly didn't think I'd be ready to return to the sea again so soon, William. But when the wind shifts, we must trim our sails to suit. Who knows what London might hold? Our revolution has only just begun, and the horizons have opened wide. I can't let my parents down. I have a good foundation, and the Lord said in the Gospels, to whom much is given, much is required. The problem is I'm not sure what I'm required to do. I know I can do more than what I've done already. I've risked my life for our nation's independence, my family, and our people. Philadelphia will be here when we get back. And who knows, but we might just learn a thing or two in London from the British after all. But come, William, enough of this talk. It's high time we put to sea and find out what kind of voyage we're in for.
Good evening. My name is Michael Idriss, and I am the African American Interpretive Fellow here at the Museum of the American Revolution. I am with Kalela Williams, And the painting that you see behind me is one that is connected with the play that you just heard discussing James Forten. This is a moment here, and this painting is titled Brave Men as Ever Fought. It was done by artist Don Troiani. It was especially commissioned for the exhibit that is currently taking place here at the museum, Liberty, the paintings of Don Troiani, so that you can get the opportunity to see James Forten viewing Philadelphia in between his two tours as a privateer. So in this painting, you actually get to see 15-year-old James Forten on his birthday. James Forten was born on September 2nd, 1766. So on his 15th birthday, Forten is seeing troops from the Rhode Island Regiment as they link with Washington's troops on their way to Yorktown. So it's just an awesome scene to see James Forten given that moment of reflection with his hat in the middle there. You can see as these members of the Rhode Island Regiment, predominantly African-American members of this particular group moving through. So just an awesome scene. So we are just getting ready for our actor, Nathan Alford-Tate, as we begin this discussion that Kalela will be moderating tonight. So it's good to see Nathan here, and as we get ready to get started.
Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. That was amazing.
Thank you.
I just always love seeing it. It's, yeah. So, gosh, so many questions, so many questions to ask. I'm going to start with the idea of why we're all here tonight. Why are we here? What does James Forten's story have to tell us today?
Oh, wow. Well, for me, James Forten's story, what's so critical is as a person of African descent who, as a 9-year-old, witnessed the words of the Declaration of Independence being read by Sheriff John Nixon for the very first time, places him at a very integral point in American history. And then to see a free person of African descent making decisions to decide how in my life am I going to choose to serve this burgeoning country. And he is seeing events as a young man in the city where the First Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress are taking place. So all this is happening within the backdrop of young James Forten's life. And to think that he will serve as a privateer and then go on to do incredible work as a sailmaker, but connecting that work to other pursuits is something that's really important and something that we need to center and to think about.
Thank you. I'm going to actually, before we go to you, Nathan, I'm
Okay.
just going to quickly ask that question again because I know that there is a little bit of a glitch with my sound. So the question is, what does James Forten's story have to tell us today?
All right. For me, it tells such a great story of hope and tenacity. The fact that he did all of that in his, very short 18 years of life. I mean, he did more afterwards, but to do so much in so little time, I think that is just very inspiring. And not only to think about what America is, but imagine what America could be. We see that in his actions, and when he lets Daniel Bruton onto the sea chest to go in place of himself. That's just the equal. That's something that rang true for him, that equality.
Thank you. That was such just a really compelling part of this piece. It's really great how there's new talent brought in, and then of course Seth Reingat, who directed the piece, is someone who the museum has worked with many times. Marissa Kennedy, who wrote the play, is someone who the museum has worked with. So, Michael, this question is for you. Can you talk about the conception of this from the ground up and creating this program from the ground up?
It's like to understand, like, it's so much of James Forten's life that you really wanted to unpack. And the hardest part was sort of just boiling it down. So to look at just his service in as a privateer was really important because, like Nathan just said, he managed to do so much in a short period of time. His connection into the sail-making trade from his father up until the age of 7, where he has to make a shift into pursuing his education, but then also taking up odd jobs to support the family. But then again, seeing the backdrop of all the things that are taking place, not just in Philadelphia, but up and down the colonies at that time, then deciding he wanted to serve, but all of you put it all together and it becomes something that's incredibly compelling, something that is incredibly rich. And I think that's really where this begins to take shape. So we started by learning objectives. One of the things I wanted to do was how, where, and how do we want individuals to meet James Forten. We don't want to necessarily make him out to be just this incredible, untouchable hero, but we wanted to give him some scope and space so that you could feel who he is from the neighborhood that he's in here in Dock Ward, and just giving some lift to who he is, and just kind of understanding some of the spaces and people that he would encounter in his young life. So to start from there, really kind of focusing on ways to bring that space out, but then to understand his skill craft, utilizing the FID. So we wanted to put that all together into sort of a real educational component that was also very entertaining as well.
It was. I loved the physicality of this. And Nathan, actually, my next question is for you, and that is, you've been doing this role for quite a bit. What was it like becoming James Forten as a young man? What was it like stepping into this role? And what is it like now that you've done it for a little bit of time? What is it like inhabiting this role now?
Absolutely. It's big shoes to fill. You know, in the beginning, there was, you know, I had to really focus on getting all the lines down and, you know, things of that nature. But once I began to get comfortable with the text, and I was really able to play and think about, you know, what could James be thinking in these moments? What does it mean to hear these words, the Declaration of Independence for the first time? And what does it mean to be in these different settings? And I'm just so grateful and really honored to be able to do this in multiple times. I think that it's such a pleasure to be able to share this information with so many people, and I try my best to treat each performance as the first performance.
It really does. The performance really does just, it just embodies the space. And my next question, you mentioned Don Troiani's painting, which is right behind us. Well, we're actually in a whole gallery full of his paintings, but As Brave Men as Ever Fought is right behind us. And how did this inform both the production of this, the creation of this, as well as the performance of this piece?
It really comes down to visuals and giving, it's always great to have a multi-sensory experience and to know of the moment, to read it, a reflection of it in Julie Winch's book, A Gentleman of Color. It's incredible, but then to actually see it come to life and to see the dirt roads, to understand the different faces, to also really just think of James Forten just being a 15-year-old and what that means. And then, of course, the iconic space that's in this painting isn't Independence Hall quite yet. It is the State House, but being able to also center, you know, this iconic image of America and to have a young man of African descent be right at the center of this and how it shapes his life and his reflections of looking at other men of African descent march through Philadelphia in their Rhode Island Regiment uniform with their hunting shirts, and just, again, that thread of connection. It's an intergenerational connection. Some of these men are older than James, might be, some could even been around potentially the age of his father. So it's just being able to see yourself reflected in other people, which I think is very powerful, and it's a great scene that often is not something that one can close their eyes and imagine. You don't have to do that any longer. There's an actual visual to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And something that I think about, like something that I focus in on is like the dust rising and seeing all the different hats, you know, seeing all the people marching along, imagining how loud that must be and exhilarating. You know, I think that there must have been so much excitement and invigoration from these words being read and seeing the Rhode Island Regiment cross.
Yeah, I love how the paintings really speak to the museum itself, because that's the idea of noise and sound. And you know, when you walk through the exhibitions in the museum, you can hear voices, you can hear people whispering, you can hear people shouting. So my next question, Nathan, is also for you, and that is student groups. Can you talk about how student groups, how is speaking with student groups different from speaking with general audiences? Is there a difference?
There is a bit of a difference in the sense that, you know, for the time being, a lot of the educational performances are over Zoom. So it's very similar to the performance tonight, where I'm performing by myself in a room and all the other school groups are over Zoom. They'll ask questions, things of that nature. And I've really just been very excited by their questions. They've asked some very challenging ones, whether, you know, me as an artist, but also, you know, how do I relate to James Forten? Why do, you know, I think one question that they might have asked you today was, why do you think that he allowed Daniel Bruton to go into the sea chest instead of going himself? And, you know, I think very thought-provoking questions. And I'm just so excited that students at this young age, at the young age that they're at, are able to receive all this rich information.
Thank you. And actually, just sort of going back to the beginning of this again, the idea of how this performance, how the creation of this was informed by primary sources. Can you tell us first of all, what are primary sources and how they informed this piece?
Kalela, one of the things that's most challenging about this work, especially when you're assembling, is getting the actual voice of the person. Especially when you're talking about descendants of African descent, there is not always a large body of letters that the individual themselves were able to write, that we have record, that we can actually disseminate information from. We're very fortunate with James Forten to be able to have a good collection of letters to family, to friends, to politicians, to intermediaries, other people in business and his scope that he's working with. So with James, and also corresponds with his family as well. So that rich resource helps us to be able to find words and phrases in his life that speaks to Nathan's performance. One of the things that I love is when he talks about never giving up his allegiance to his country. Like, he says that. Those are actually James Forten's words, to hear him voice that I'm not going to take the easy way out. And I just think that's an incredible reflection of his character and of just who he was as a person. So I think it's really important to note that Forten's words were very much integral into this performance, into this piece.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts about any words that you read that might have especially, I mean, obviously you're reading a script, but anything that especially sort of enhanced the way that you perform this?
Similar to not wanting to be a traitor for, you know, his country's interests. Something that I really love, one of the lines that I really love is, I sailed too far to abandon the cause now. And, you know, to say that and to think that, like, I'm in it now, and we're just going to have to see this through.
Thank you. So I have a question about youth and about, because it's incredible that this is a story of Forten's boyhood. This is a story of Forten from the age of 14 through the age of 18. He was a young man. And so my question is, did your experiences as a teenager, as a young man, did that inspire in any way? Were you able to draw from any experiences? I'm sure that you didn't spend it on a prison ship, but were you able to draw from any experiences or any just insights from your younger self? Any way that you could pull from that to take with you to this performance?
That's a good question. I think something that in my youth, I really loved, what I imagined James to be is someone that is very, I don't know if a social butterfly is an appropriate word, but I think that's what I kind of see him as, in the sense of he's moving in all of these settings. I think when I first read the script and he was at his father's sail loft and doing work and things of that nature, but when I seen it, I was like, oh, he was 7. As a 7-year-old, that's a much different thing, and so you have to be, as a child, he could only have been so talkative but also very focused, and I think that was something that I really related to, and also being a bit of a social butterfly, not as focused, I'll admit, in my youth, but it's definitely something that I appreciate.
It's always humbling when you read about children of the Revolutionary era. You see sometimes their handwriting, their calligraphy, and you're just like, what?
Right.
Mike, do you have any way to weigh in? Do you feel like there were some experiences as you were creating this, as you were sort of envisioning this, that you could draw from?
I just think taking in the sights and sounds, again, being that there was no other generation that saw what was unfold the way it did. Like, you might have seen the 7 Years' War, but it wasn't as, it doesn't seem as encompassing as the Road to the Revolution. And to kind of think of what James is seeing in other school kids' age, what they're doing, potentially as well, adding that to the mix, and just the other young men that he's coming in contact with, Captain Baisley's children, 2 sons, Daniel Bruton, the individuals that he might have gone to school with at Anthony Benezet's school. So it just really does give you insight into the lives of young people. And what I think is really important is that's transferable to when young people actually see the play itself. And they can think, wow, he was doing all this. He was working with a FID. He is taking up the scrap pieces, working with wax, doing all these different, some pretty tough work. But it doesn't sound like he's like poo-pooing that, because that's the time in which he lived. And I think it's important for young people to not always place the demands, the context of today into the lives of individuals who lived in the past, so that we can give, James that space, and others that lived in that space as well, some intentionality and some understanding, connection with the world in which he lived.
And I want to go back to this idea of the items and what we know and how we know what we know. And that is, how do we know what James Forten looked like? And also, how was that used in terms of Don Troiani creating this image of him?
Well, what's really cool about this image too is because this is in between his 2 privateer excursions, we get a look at James Forten maybe with some money in his pocket. Nathan says, I got money in my pocket. That's awesome, because it's explaining what it means to be a privateer, maybe getting a nice cut of the bounty of some of the things that you were able to procure from other ships, and how there's some pride, there's some swagger in his step. We know what it feels like when you get that, that fresh set, and you go get your hair cut, and you go out and hit the town. I'm not, for James, there's pride in your posture, and to feel that. So that's a real connective symbolism that I think young people can appreciate, and it just gives you another clearer window into his life.
And we do have an image of James Forten that survives as an older person, but we do, it's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, but we have a replica of it here. We have an image of him here. So we actually do have a portrait of him.
So it's really cool too, because Nathan's costume is what a sailor, someone who's working at sea, would have been wearing the way he wears his handkerchief. There's some stylized ways of doing that. There's a way of kind of dangling the tassel to your shoe in a sort of a dandy swagger way for those that work at sea. So we wanted to give some individuality to it as well, so that you can really appreciate, the fullness of his costume and just his persona.
And that actually goes to my next question, which has to do with what we wear. So you as an actor, you're used to costumes, but are you used to wearing hand-sewn, absolutely historical, accurate to the best of our knowledge, garments like what you're wearing today? Because what you're wearing, somebody actually sewed this by hand, the way that it would have been done by perhaps Forten's mom or perhaps his sister back when he was this age. How does this feel to embody this?
It is such a great help to really figure out, oh, wow, this is, just in terms of how you're able to move in regards to the shoes. These shoes, they don't have a lot of grip, and so I'm on the tile floor, I have to really walk like I'm on ice. But, in regards to even the pants, they're typically they're from like the scraps that weren't used for sales and things like that. And I am really, really warm. And it is just getting used to various aspects of this outfit. But it helped inform me of how James could have moved, what were the things that were possible in terms of like range of motion and different things like that. I do want to add really fast, just the one thing that is so interesting to me is the string. Instead of, while I do have buttons on my pants, there's a sort of shoestring on the back that's used as a belt. And if you could think of sweatpants, but backwards in order to tighten them. It's different, I'll say.
It is always interesting, this idea of, as someone who's done historical interpretation myself, and it is interesting, this idea of these underpinnings. For women, of course, you have stays, and it's just sort of like, you drop something and you're like, oh.
Someone else can get that, please.
Well, no, it's seriously. I was at the museum once in costume, and I dropped something, and I asked a guest to pick it up for me because I'm just like, hey, this is awkward. So do you have any insights as far as your working in costume, working in these historically accurate garments?
Especially, yes, because one of the individuals that I take on a persona would have been an elder to James Forten, Cyrus Bustle. A Philadelphia baker, and being able to tell his story, someone that would have worked with James later in his life, someone Cyrus's daughter would have worked with, knew young James Forten as well. So, in that particular costume, there's a nice little apron that goes with it, and it's just something rich about being in costume, and there's something that you can transfer and to change someone's concept of what especially people of African descent, what that looks like. There's sort of limited thoughts of based on a person standing, if he was enslaved or if they were free, of what their work was like. And these individuals contributed in so many ways, from their skill set, from their contributions and just engagement with their community. So all of that can be encompassed by just being in costume and just giving life and image to something that is not something that is given a visual very often.
It is interesting, this idea of community, because in our historical personas, we would have all known each other. I portrayed a school teacher, Helena Harris, also known as Eleanor Harris, and so it's just this very interesting, we would know each other.
We would have known each other, which is fascinating.
It's just a weird thing went through my head of, oh wow, it's almost like stepping back in time. So my next question is an audience question, and this is a really, just a really compelling question, and that is, can you comment on portraying James Forten as a free person, but who's living with the trauma, knowing that his that his people are enslaved, and that fear of also being captured and sold into slavery as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very interesting vantage point that James had. In the sense of there was a bit of privilege that not many were afforded during that time, of course, but to know that sort of at any moment that could be really taken away, similar to when they were captured and, put upon the Amphion. And he says, possibly going into the cane fields and, different things like that. There were instances in his life where he was getting very close to that line. So yeah.
And it's so interesting when during the performance, when you are in this ship and you think, this must be what it's like. This must have been, or I wonder if this was what it was like. That way that the experiences are speaking to, that lived experience is speaking to an ancestral experience.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, him just giving pause to take that into account, what the possibilities were, being sent off, the differences, the juxtaposition between white officers, potentially just being imprisoned for the entirety of the war, wherever that might have been at that time, versus never seeing your family again. It could be as a potential consequence for you, or again, doing labor in a space so far away, disconnected from your family, what the end result possibilities were. So he's 15, remember. So who do you discuss this with? How do you build community within those spaces? And one of the things that I love about Julie Winch's book is she talks about that. He does build community on the Amphion. And I think it's really important to know as a sailor that strong connection of men of African descent, talk about that motley crew. James is probably more educated than many of those men that he's in that conditions with. There are potentially, relationships as far as building trust on the Royal Lewis, that people know who James is and what his responsibilities were. So it's really important to kind of think about how he sort of ingratiates himself there, but then coming out of that, as a free person of African descent, understanding how many people he sees in Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia is the largest city of free people of African descent during James's early years. So, but he is also very much seeing people enslaved in Philadelphia and the juxtaposition of that as well. So this will, again, undergird the rest of his life and the works that he will do.
We actually have a message from a Forten descendant who's saying, thank you, Nate, for that heartfelt performance. It makes him extremely proud to be a direct descendant of James Forten. That's very, very cool. This is just amazing. And can you talk about the importance of the power of genealogy in your work and for living history?
It's the constellation. It's what we use. It gives us that map. It's so much more. It's talking about the family trees. You're talking about timelines that you can put certain dates up against what else is going on in locally, statewide, nationally, to put things into context. Also, just seeing where people decide to break off, so there's just so many important components to it. But then to take everything, take that sky view of this family tree, and to remember, James wasn't the first descendant who was a free person of African descent. So that's another, really remarkable story in and of itself, and how long their family has been here in Philadelphia, going back to, this potentially 1680s, when William Penn and the founding of the city. As far as the founding of the city, this was a space that, of course, was inhabited by the Lenni Lenape. So we need to talk about going all the way back, but it's important to kind of keep everything in context of where the family originated and where it is today, and where we are here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such an amazing thing to be able to, it's such an honor to be able to perform for a descendant of James Forten. I think that's amazing. Just the ability to be able to track your lineage in such a way, for my family, personally, I'm able to track a few generations beyond, for me, I knew my great-grandmother, and I think just that passing on the baton and, and the fact that James's children really continue the work, of abolitionist work, and really helped continue keep his legacy going.
Yeah, it really is. I imagine that this has encouraged you to maybe study more about your family history.
Oh, absolutely. I'm someone who doesn't know a lot about my mother's side of her family going back so far. So this definitely, it always piqued my interest. It's something before this, but even more so now. But also, underscoring the challenges as an African American and being able to really go back into your families. There's so many people whose families have been scattered, and it's very challenging to do this work. But it's so wonderful that we have a lot of friends of the museum who have done that work and that do workshops to help others begin to stitch their family legacies together. So it's really important work, and we're so thankful that we have such great friends to continue to help us and inspire us to continue on to find our backgrounds and our past.
So it is absolutely amazing that James Forten survived all of these experiences. It's a fortune for us. Can you talk about his adult life and his adult work and his work in abolition, his work as an activist?
Man, I can't. I would be remiss if I didn't start with the Forten women. And you talk about his wife Charlotte, and then you go from there to especially his daughters Sarah Louise, Harriet, Margaretta, and how they work together, establishing schools, becoming pillars of the community, linking up with the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, helping to establish Pennsylvania Hall. So that scope of work coming out of James Forten is incredible. But then to think about what James did in taking over Robert Bridges' business, like to think, he starts just doing odd jobs. Bridges is so taken aback by him that he continually brings him up and gives him more positions within the sale loft. And when Bridges is ready to retire, he passes the baton to James Forten to start that, to take over the business, where he becomes a thriving thousandaire and really becomes a pillar of his community. I like to think of him in a lot of respects as like to what Benjamin Franklin was in sort of mid-century 1700s Philadelphia. Forten, in a lot of ways, especially in the Black community, is that and more in a lot of the responsibilities that he's taking on as well. So really, as a steward and a pillar of the Black Philadelphia community.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Forten women, because that was, even into the era, even into the far 19th century, where we have Charlotte Forten, his granddaughter. So a lot of important people who did amazing things. So going forward, what else are we hoping to discover about James Forten, about Black Revolutionary War soldiers, about what else are we looking to discover, and how will that be brought to life here at the museum?
Going forward, we are working diligently on an upcoming, something that we're working on, an exhibition on the Forten family. It's just amazing how much has been scaffolded in the past few years since I've been here, from discovery carts and from Forten's work in the galleries to virtual programming that gives insight to Forten's story. There's just so much to build upon, and I'm very excited to incorporate Nathan's work. We have other pieces to this play as well that we'll see life one day. So it's just a constant building of the connective threads that Forten has laid right down the street from where the museum is today. We're right down the street from where James Forten grew up. So as a Philadelphian, you should walk around and feel the connection to the spaces and places that James Forten and his family, and really all of those that worked around him, from the Richard Allens to the Absalom Joneses to the Sarah Bass Allens. It's just incredible to see all this constellation of people put together.
So we've got a few minutes left. I've got a couple of questions I want to ask, and one is an audience question. It's a great question, and that is, Nathan, what's the best question you've gotten from a kid about your performance?
Best question. I think it would probably be how do I most relate with James Forten? Something similar to what I had spoke about earlier. And I think some other, just really nice questions were, they were saying like, how do you, one of the questions, something to the effect of, what was your like funniest mess up out of the performances? And it was so honest that I was like, oh, yeah, I actually have to think about that. So I love that honesty. Yeah.
Awesome. So the question that I want to wrap up with is, we've got an anniversary coming up. 2026 is going to be Forten's anniversary of hearing the Declaration of Independence, and our anniversary of the Declaration of Independence as a nation. How do you want Forten to be remembered across the nation? And this is an audience question, and a good one from whoever asked it.
I want James Forten. I want Elizabeth Freeman. I want all of these, these really, these stories that often have been not shared nationally, to be in the same echelon as what we consider the founders. They are the founders. They're the founding blocks in so many different ways. If we think about Forten's work as a sailmaker, Forten's work as a privateer, his connections to the Declaration. Same thing for someone like Elizabeth Freeman, how she worked with early founding documents to get her to her story of freedom. So all of that should be in that pot when we talk about stories that talk about the inception of this country.
Absolutely. I think that really got right to the point. Yeah, and really just understanding the seeing the different perspectives that were there when the Declaration was being read, and who was affected by it, and what ways. I think that's such a important part to learn. For me, I think growing up, I didn't really know. I think there's a sort of understanding that it was equal, but not really equal, and it was for everyone, but not really everyone. And so to hear that a person of African descent heard these words and was charged in such a way to live out his life as how we've read and seen, I think it's just remarkable.
Thank you so much. I think that's what's really special about this museum, is the way, for me, it's the way that I can see myself back during the revolution. The revolution belongs to all of us, and I think that's really, really special. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much, Mike Idriss. Thank you so much, Nathan Alford-Tate. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in, and please catch us at the next program, and also come to the museum. Come visit.
Come visit us for sure.